You can tell everything about a civilization by watching who it lets go hungry. The lower food court of Meridian Station smelled like burnt oil, recycled air, and cheap synthetic noodles. Thousands of travelers moved through the massive terminal beneath flickering neon advertisements, while cargo freighters groaned somewhere beyond the steel walls like tired metal giants. Steam hissed from cracked vents overhead. Service drones floated between crowded tables carrying trays of glowing drinks and processed meat wraps that cost more credits than most dock workers made in a shift. Nobody looked at each other for long on Meridian. That was one of the station's oldest survival rules. Especially not in Sector 9. Especially not at dinner hour. Ethan Cole tightened the last bolt beneath a malfunctioning heating vent and wiped grease across the sleeve of his faded work jacket. His knees ached from crouching on cold metal for nearly 3 hours. The station's maintenance department kept promising replacement parts, but promises were cheaper than repairs. Above him, the heater finally rattled back to life with a tired hum, spilling weak warmth across the crowded dining corridor. A few people nearby barely noticed. One man cursed because his coffee had gone cold. Another shoved past a service robot carrying trays stacked too high. Same station. Same noise. Same endless hunger wearing different faces. Ethan climbed down from the maintenance ladder and reached for his datapad to submit the repair ticket when laughter erupted near the center tables. Loud laughter. Sharp laughter. The kind meant to cut somebody open without touching them. He ignored it at first. Most people on Meridian survived by minding their own business. But then he heard the sound of a tray hitting the floor. Metal clattered across the tiles. More laughter followed. Ethan looked up. The alien girl was kneeling beside the overturned tray while scattered noodles and strips of protein paste slid across the dirty floor. She didn't speak, didn't yell, didn't even look angry. She just stared at the food for one frozen second before quietly reaching down to pick it up with shaking blue fingers. Her skin carried a pale silver-blue glow beneath the station lights, almost ghost-like against the dark crowd surrounding her. She looked young, maybe early 20s by human standards. Too thin. Her oversized gray coat hung loose around narrow shoulders, and strands of silver hair covered part of her face as she crouched lower to the ground. Guess royal blood doesn't buy dinner anymore. One dock merchant snorted from a nearby table. Careful, another said with a grin. She might trade you an old empire for a sandwich. More laughter. Nobody helped her. A hovering service drone flashed a red warning light above the spill. Cleaning violation detected. Please clear the area. The girl moved faster after hearing the drone. Not because she feared punishment. Ethan recognized that kind of movement. It was embarrassment. The quiet, desperate kind. She tried to gather the food before the cleaning unit arrived to vacuum it away. Ethan stared at her for a long moment while station noise blurred around him. He noticed small things. The way her hands trembled from hunger. The way she avoided eye contact like she already expected cruelty before anyone spoke. The way her eyes kept drifting toward the food she couldn't save anymore. Then he saw her lift a small piece of noodle from the floor and eat it, slowly, like she hoped nobody would notice. Something inside Ethan tightened. The cleaning drone descended with a mechanical buzz, suction vents spinning alive. The girl immediately pulled back as the machine devoured the scattered meal piece by piece. More laughter rolled through the tables nearby. Ethan looked down at the warm meal sitting untouched in his own hands. Double protein noodles. Cheap coffee. His entire dinner after a 14-hour shift. He stared at it another second. Then he started walking toward her. Ethan stopped beside her table while the cleaning drone finished vacuuming the last scraps from the floor. The machine floated away with a cheerful chime completely disconnected from the humiliation it had just erased. Around them, conversations resumed almost immediately. Meridian Station had mastered the art of forgetting uncomfortable things in under 10 seconds. Steam drifted upward from the tray in Ethan's hands. The synthetic noodles smelled faintly of pepper and garlic powder. Not good food, just hot food. Sometimes that was enough. The alien girl remained crouched beside the empty floor tiles with her head lowered beneath the silver strands of hair hanging over her face. Ethan noticed how tightly her fingers curled inward now that there was nothing left to pick up. "Hey," he said quietly. She stiffened immediately. Not fear exactly. More like exhaustion preparing for another insult. Ethan nudged a nearby chair away from the table with his boot. "Sit down," he said, "before it gets cold." She slowly looked up at him for the first time. Her eyes were striking even in the harsh station lighting. pale violet with silver around the edges like frost forming across glass. But beneath that beauty sat something older. Wariness. The kind built over years instead of days. Why? She asked. Her voice sounded rough from dehydration. Ethan shrugged once. Because I cannot eat 2 dinners. A couple merchants nearby snorted at that. One muttered something under his breath about humans collecting stray aliens now. Ethan ignored them. The girl looked at the steaming tray again, then at him, then back at the tray. He could almost see the argument happening inside her head. Pride against hunger. Hunger was winning. Slowly she stood up from the floor. Taller than he expected. Maybe 6'2" in bare feet, though the way she held herself made her seem smaller. Her oversized coat hung nearly to her knees, sleeves covering most of her hands. She sat carefully across from him like she expected the invitation to disappear at any second. Ethan slid the tray toward the center of the table. You can take the first half, he said. She stared at him another moment before finally reaching for the plastic fork resting beside the noodles. Her hand trembled slightly. Ethan pretended not to notice. That mattered sometimes. Letting people keep what little dignity they had left. The station lights reflected softly across her blue skin, while steam curled between them in thin white ribbons. For several seconds, she only looked at the food instead of eating it. Then she took one careful bite. Ethan saw her shoulders loosen almost immediately. Just a little. Like her body remembered warmth before her mind allowed it. She ate slowly at first. Too slowly for someone obviously starving. Small bites. Measured movements. Survival behavior. People who had gone hungry long enough learned to hide desperation even from themselves. Ethan leaned back in the metal chair and sipped his coffee while cargo alarms echoed faintly somewhere deeper in the station. Outside the massive observation windows behind them, freighters drifted through the blackness beyond Meridian like floating cities covered in blinking lights. What is your name? She asked after several quiet minutes. Ethan. He nodded toward her. You? She hesitated. Lyra. Ethan noticed she did not offer a last name. Usually that meant one of 2 things on Meridian Station. Either somebody was hiding from debt collectors, or from history. A cleaning bot rolled past their table carrying fresh utensils. Its optical sensor paused briefly on Lyra before continuing on. Even the machines recognized her species. Ethan saw the reaction in nearby faces too. Tiny glances. Quick whispers. Discomfort. The old scars of some war he only half remembered from news feeds years ago. Lyra lowered her eyes again after noticing the stares. You should not sit with me, she said softly. People here do not like my kind. Ethan tore a piece from the station bread roll beside his tray. Dry as insulation foam. People here do not like anybody, he replied. For the first time, the corner of Lyra's mouth moved slightly upward. Not quite a smile, but close. The dinner crowd slowly shifted around them like a river flowing past 2 stones. Forks scraped against trays. Cargo pilots argued over docking fees near the drink dispensers. Somewhere above the food court, an arriving freighter triggered a deep vibration through the station floor that rattled glasses across nearby tables. Lyra kept eating in careful silence while Ethan drank the last of his coffee. He noticed she never took large bites. Never relaxed completely. Every few seconds her eyes flicked toward the exits as if she expected someone to force her away from the table. Meridian Station taught habits like that. Ethan had seen it before in exhausted workers arriving from failed colonies or refugees hiding from border disputes. People stopped believing they belonged anywhere. You work maintenance? Lyra asked quietly after a while. Ethan glanced down at the grease stains covering his hands. Most days. Most. Sometimes repair work. Sometimes heating systems. Sometimes unclogging sewage pipes when the station decides to hate everybody equally. That finally earned a small reaction from her. Not a full smile, but enough for him to notice faint silver dimples forming near the corners of her mouth before she lowered her eyes again. You joke often, she said. Only when things are bad. Then Meridian Station must be very funny. Ethan let out a short laugh through his nose. You are catching on already. Outside the observation windows, the stars drifted behind slow-moving freighters wrapped in blue engine light. Lyra stared at them for several seconds. Ethan noticed how different she looked now compared to 20 minutes earlier. Still thin, still exhausted, but warmth had returned faintly to her face. Human beings underestimated food sometimes. A warm meal could feel like somebody handing your existence back to you one bite at a time. A loud voice suddenly echoed across the dining corridor. Well now, Look what crawled back into public. Ethan looked up. A broad-shouldered merchant in a dark crimson shipping coat approached from the neighboring tables carrying a half-empty drink pouch. Two others followed behind him with amused expressions. The merchant stopped beside their table and looked directly at Lyra. I heard rumors, he said loudly enough for nearby diners to overhear. Did not believe them at first. Lyra's shoulders stiffened immediately. Ethan caught the movement before she could hide it. You mistaken me for someone else? She said quietly. No, the merchant grinned. I know those eyes. Nearby conversations began slowing again as people listened. Meridian Station loved public discomfort almost as much as cheap alcohol. The merchant pulled out his datapad and activated the display screen. A holographic image flickered above the table. Ethan only caught a glimpse before Lyra looked away. A younger version of her appeared in ceremonial silver clothing standing beside tall alien officials beneath enormous banners. Wealth, power, nobility. House Vane, the merchant announced dramatically, one of the families who abandoned half the frontier systems during the collapse. A few people nearby muttered under their breath after hearing the name. Ethan remembered fragments now. News reports from years ago. Economic wars. Refugee crises. Entire colonies cut off after hyperspace routes failed. Looks like royalty is eating maintenance worker noodles now, one of the merchant's friends joked. More laughter followed. Lyra slowly pushed the tray away from herself. The hunger was still there in her eyes, but shame had returned stronger. I should leave, she whispered. Ethan leaned back in his chair and looked at the merchant instead. You done? The merchant blinked once, probably surprised somebody had interrupted the performance. You know who she is? No, Ethan said calmly. And honestly, I was enjoying dinner before you arrived. A few nearby workers smirked into their drinks. The merchant's grin faded slightly. People like her ruined entire systems. Ethan glanced toward Lyra. She had not defended herself once. Had not argued. That told him more than the hologram did. Guilty people usually shouted first. Broken people stayed quiet. Ethan looked back at the merchant. Maybe, he said. But tonight she was just hungry. Silence settled across the nearby tables for one long second. Then the merchant scoffed and waved dismissively before walking away with his friends. The crowd slowly returned to their own conversations again. Lyra remained perfectly still beside the untouched tray. Her hands trembled slightly beneath the oversized sleeves of her coat. Ethan gently pushed the noodles back toward her side of the table. Eat while it is still warm, he said softly. The station already charged me for it anyway. Lyra stared down at the tray for several seconds after the merchant disappeared into the crowd. The steam rising from the noodles had grown thinner now, fading into the cold, recycled air above the table. Around them, Meridian Station continued moving like nothing had happened. Dishes clattered. Boarding announcements echoed through ceiling speakers in 6 different languages. Somewhere deeper in the station, a cargo loader released a metallic groan that vibrated faintly through the floor beneath Ethan's boots. But something between them had changed. Ethan could feel it. Before, Lyra had looked at him with caution. Now she looked at him like she did not understand him at all. You should not have defended me, she said softly. Ethan shrugged and tore another piece from the dry station bread. I did not defend anybody. He chewed once before continuing. I just wanted to finish dinner without listening to idiots. A faint silver reflection danced in Lyra's eyes as she studied him across the table. You are strange for a human. That is fair. Most people hear the name Vane and immediately decide what I deserve. Ethan leaned back in the chair, metal creaking beneath his weight. Most people on this station decide everything too quickly. Lyra lowered her gaze toward the tray again. Some of them are not wrong. Ethan noticed the way she said it. Not angry, not defensive, tired, like somebody carrying guilt too heavy to keep arguing against. Outside the observation windows, a massive freight vessel slowly drifted away from Meridian Station, its engine lights glowing pale blue against the endless black beyond the glass. The ship looked enormous up close. But out there among the stars, even giants eventually disappeared into darkness. You ever notice something? Ethan asked suddenly. Lyra glanced up. Notice what? He nodded toward the stars outside. Every ship leaving this station looks important for about 30 seconds. She followed his eyes toward the observation window. And then space reminds everybody how small they really are. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The station noise softened around the edges while distant stars drifted silently beyond the glass. Lyra finally took another bite of noodles. Slower this time. Less desperate. Ethan noticed color returning faintly beneath her pale blue skin now that she had eaten half the tray. A nearby service drone floated past carrying fresh coffee cartridges. Its soft white lights reflected off the silver strands of Lyra's hair, while warm air from the repaired heating vent drifted gently across the table. "How long have you been on Meridian?" Ethan asked. Lyra hesitated before answering. 3 months. 3 months. He frowned slightly. Doing what? Trying not to be recognized. Ethan glanced toward the corridor where the merchant had vanished earlier. Sounds like that strategy needs work. To his surprise, Lyra let out a quiet laugh. It was small and rough from exhaustion, but real enough to briefly soften the sadness in her face. Ethan found himself smiling a little too. "There it is," he said. "What? Proof you are still alive under all that misery." Her expression shifted again after that. Softer now, almost confused by her own reaction. "I had forgotten what laughing felt like," she admitted quietly. Ethan looked away for a second after hearing that. Something about the sentence sat heavily in his chest. Nobody should forget something that basic. Not laughter, not warmth, not dinner at a table without fear. An automated voice suddenly echoed across the food court. "Curfew warning for lower dock sectors in 30 minutes. Unregistered civilians must clear commercial areas." Lyra immediately stiffened at the announcement. Ethan noticed it instantly. "You got somewhere to go?" he asked. Her silence answered first. Then she shook her head once. Ethan rubbed a tired hand across the back of his neck while thinking. Outside the station windows, another freighter disappeared into the stars. "Well," he muttered finally, "that is a problem." Lyra carefully pushed the empty tray aside and folded her hands together beneath the oversized sleeves of her coat. "You have already done more than enough for me tonight, Ethan." He looked at the empty tray between them, then at how hard she tried not to appear afraid. "Yeah," he said quietly. "That sounds exactly like something somebody with nowhere to sleep would say." The curfew alarms repeated every 30 seconds now, softer than before but impossible to ignore. Red warning lights blinked along the ceiling edges of the food court, while station security drones floated into nearby corridors preparing to clear lower commercial sectors for the night cycle. Around them, tables emptied one by one. Workers gathered tool cases. Cargo crews finished drinks in hurried silence. Meridian Station never truly slept, but certain parts of it became dangerous after curfew if you had nowhere official to be. Ethan stood up slowly from the table and grabbed the empty tray. "Come on," he said. Lyra looked up immediately. "Where are we going?" "Maintenance sector." He stacked the plastic utensils onto the tray. "My shift ended 2 hours ago, which means technically I am already disappointing management. No reason to stop now." Lyra remained seated for a moment. "Ethan." He glanced back at her. "You do not know anything about me." "Sure I do." He started walking toward the disposal station. "You eat noodles too slowly and you laugh at terrible jokes. That is enough information for one night." She stared at him another second before finally standing and following behind. The two of them moved through the crowded corridor together while automated shutters slowly lowered over nearby storefronts. Neon signs flickered against polished steel walls covered in old shipping advertisements and faded warnings printed in multiple languages. Warm air carried the smell of engine coolant and synthetic coffee through the station vents. Lyra walked carefully beside him with her oversized coat pulled tightly around herself. Ethan noticed people staring again as they passed. Some recognized her species. Some recognized her face. Others simply noticed someone poor enough to look invisible. Meridian was full of people pretending not to see suffering unless it entertained them. Ethan tapped his wrist badge against a security gate leading into a narrow maintenance corridor. The heavy door slid open with a hydraulic hiss, and suddenly the noise of the main station softened behind them. The hallway beyond was quieter, dimmer. Pipes lined the ceiling overhead, while exposed wiring ran beneath grated floors glowing faintly blue from the reactor. "Levels below. You live down here?" Lyra asked quietly. "Depends how generous your definition of living is." Ethan led her deeper into the corridor. "Maintenance workers get sleeping units close to the repair sectors. Saves the station from paying transport costs. You joke about everything. Only the depressing parts." A faint smile touched her face again before disappearing almost immediately. Ethan noticed she seemed warmer now than when he first met her. Not physically, emotionally. Like someone slowly remembering how to exist beside another person without expecting cruelty. They stopped outside a narrow metal door marked Unit C-19. Ethan pressed his thumb against the scanner pad. The lock clicked open. Warm air drifted softly from inside, carrying the scent of machine oil, detergent, and old coffee grounds. The room itself was small, maybe 200 square feet altogether. One narrow bed against the wall, a folding table covered in repair tools and loose wiring components, a tiny kitchenette with flickering overhead lights. A portable fan hummed beside an ancient heating vent that rattled constantly like it might die at any moment. Lyra stepped inside carefully, silver eyes moving slowly across the cramped room. It is smaller than I expected. Ethan tossed his jacket over the back of a chair. That is the nicest thing anybody has ever said about this place. To his surprise, Lyra laughed softly again. The sound lingered in the room a little longer this time. Ethan opened the small refrigeration unit and frowned at the nearly empty shelves inside. Half a carton of protein milk, a packet of noodles, one apple beginning to wrinkle near the edges. Well, he muttered, you officially ate most of my food supply already. Lyra's expression immediately shifted with guilt. I can leave. Relax. Ethan grabbed the apple and tossed it gently toward her. I was kidding. She caught it awkwardly against her chest, clearly surprised by the gesture. For a moment, she simply stared at the fruit in her hands like nobody had handed her something freely in a very long time. Then her eyes lifted slowly toward him again. Why are you doing this? She asked quietly. Ethan paused beside the flickering kitchenette light while distant station machinery vibrated faintly through the walls around them. He thought about giving a clever answer, but exhaustion usually made honesty easier. Because, he said softly, I think the universe has enough people willing to watch somebody starve. The old heating vent rattled above them for nearly a minute before finally coughing warm air into the room. Ethan adjusted the temperature dial with the side of a screwdriver, while Lyra remained standing near the doorway, holding the apple carefully in both hands. The tiny maintenance unit suddenly felt even smaller with another person inside it. Not uncomfortable exactly, just unfamiliar. Ethan had lived alone on Meridian Station for almost 4 years. Long enough that silence had become part of the furniture. There, he muttered after the vent stopped making violent noises. 50% chance it does not explode tonight. Lyra glanced toward the ceiling. Only 50. I like to stay optimistic. She lowered her eyes again, and Ethan noticed something strange. The exhaustion remained in her face, but some of the panic had faded. Like her body still expected danger, while her mind slowly realized nobody here intended to hurt her. Ethan grabbed a folded thermal blanket from a storage crate beneath the bed and tossed it toward the chair beside the wall. You can sleep there. Lyra caught the blanket awkwardly against her chest. And where will you sleep? Bed. That hardly seems fair. Ethan looked around the tiny room once. You are right. The floor probably builds character. Another small laugh escaped her before she could stop it. Ethan shook his head while opening a cabinet above the kitchenette. Careful, he said. At this rate, you are going to become a cheerful person. Lyra slowly sat down in the chair near the wall heater. The oversized coat shifted slightly around her shoulders while she pulled the thermal blanket across her lap. For the first time since meeting her, Ethan noticed how young she actually looked when she relaxed. Not royal. Not dangerous. Just tired. I used to hate humans, she said quietly after a long silence. Ethan opened the noodle packet and poured water into a small heating pot. That sounds healthy. I believed every story my family told me. Her silver eyes reflected softly in the dim kitchenette lights. Humans were reckless, primitive, violent. Ethan stirred the water while the heating coil glowed orange beneath the pot. To be fair, sometimes we are. Then the collapse happened. The humor disappeared from her voice. The outer systems began starving. Trade routes failed. Entire colonies lost power and medicine. Ethan listened quietly while the pot hissed beside him. My family closed our borders instead of helping. She stared down at the apple in her hands. Millions blamed House Vane after that. Did they deserve it? Ethan asked gently. Lyra did not answer immediately. The silence itself felt like an answer. Outside the thin metal walls, distant machinery vibrated softly through the station structure, while freight engines rumbled far below the maintenance sectors. Ethan finally poured the steaming noodles into 2 chipped bowls resting beside the kitchenette sink. Well, he said quietly, you were not the one making those decisions. Lyra lifted her eyes toward him again. That does not stop people from hating me for them. Ethan carried one bowl across the room and placed it carefully on the folding table beside her chair. Steam curled upward between them in soft white ribbons. People usually need someone to blame, he said. It makes pain feel organized. Lyra stared at the noodles for a moment before speaking again. You speak like somebody who has lost things too. Ethan leaned against the kitchenette counter, holding his own bowl. The question lingered in the room beside the faint hum of the ventilation system. Everybody on Meridian lost something, he said finally. That is how most people end up here. He did not explain further. He did not need to. Lyra seemed to understand anyway. The silence afterward felt different from before. Not awkward, just tired in a human way. Two strangers sitting inside a tiny maintenance room somewhere between the stars while an old heater struggled against the cold metal walls. Lyra took another careful bite from the bowl while Ethan watched the station lights flicker faintly through the narrow vent window near the ceiling. Ethan, she asked softly after a while. Yeah. She hesitated before speaking. Tonight was the first time in months that someone looked at me like a person instead of a reminder. Ethan lowered his eyes toward the steam rising from his noodles. Then everybody else on this station is blinder than I thought. Meridian Station entered artificial night cycle 3 hours later. The main corridor lights dimmed automatically while lower maintenance sectors shifted into deep blue emergency illumination that painted everything in cold shadows and soft metallic reflections. Inside Unit C-19, the old ventilation fan hummed steadily beside the rattling heater while Ethan sat cross-legged on the floor repairing a damaged circuit panel under the glow of a portable work lamp. Sparks flickered briefly beneath his screwdriver before fading again into silence. Lyra had fallen asleep in the chair sometime after midnight. Ethan noticed it gradually rather than all at once. One moment she had been quietly watching freight lights drift beyond the tiny ceiling vent. The next, her breathing slowed into the exhausted rhythm of someone finally allowing herself to rest. The thermal blanket remained wrapped tightly around her shoulders while strands of silver hair spilled across the side of her face. Even asleep, she looked tense, like her body still expected danger despite the quiet room around her. Ethan carefully lowered the screwdriver onto the floor beside the circuit panel and leaned back against the wall. For a while he simply listened to the station. The distant groan of cargo elevators. The soft vibration of reactor systems beneath the lower decks. Water moving through ancient pipes overhead. Meridian sounded alive at night. Old, tired, endless. His eyes drifted toward Lyra again. There was something deeply unsettling about seeing another person sleep like they were unfamiliar with safety. He recognized it because he had once slept the same way himself. Ready to wake up at the smallest noise. Ready to leave before someone could force you out. A sudden metallic chime shattered the silence inside the room. Ethan immediately looked toward the door console. An incoming station alert flashed red across the small monitor mounted beside the entrance. Maintenance employee Ethan Cole report to supervisor review at 0700 hours. Failure to comply will result in termination of housing privileges. Ethan stared at the message without moving. Then he quietly exhaled through his nose. Well, he muttered softly. That seems dramatic. The sound woke Lyra almost instantly. Her eyes opened wide beneath the dim blue lights, and for one brief second Ethan saw genuine fear flash across her face before recognition settled in. What happened? She asked quietly. Ethan waved toward the blinking monitor. Management remembered I exist. Lyra slowly sat upright beneath the blanket. Because of me? Ethan stood up and walked toward the kitchenette. Technically because I skipped half my shift and violated at least 4 housing regulations. He poured water into 2 small metal cups before continuing. You just happened to arrive during my career-ending phase. Lyra lowered her gaze immediately after hearing that. Ethan recognized guilt spreading across her expression before she spoke a word. I should leave before morning, she whispered. No. The answer came faster than he expected. Ethan paused briefly beside the heating unit after realizing it himself. Lyra looked up at him with surprise. The room grew quiet except for the faint hiss of warming water. Ethan rubbed tired fingers across his jaw before speaking again, more carefully. You leave tonight, and station security will stop you within an hour. He handed her one of the steaming cups. At least wait until morning. Lyra accepted the cup slowly. Her pale blue fingers curled around the warmth while thin steam drifted upward between them. You could lose your housing because of this, she said softly. Ethan leaned against the kitchenette counter and shrugged. It is a maintenance unit on a space station. It is still your home. That word lingered strangely in the room. Home. Ethan glanced around the cramped unit with its flickering lights and broken heater noises. He had never really thought of it that way before. Just a place to sleep between shifts. Somewhere temporary that accidentally lasted for years. Maybe, he admitted quietly. But you look like you needed one more than I did tonight. Lyra stared down into the steaming cup after hearing that. Outside the narrow vent near the ceiling, distant stars drifted silently beyond the station hull, while cargo lights blinked against the endless dark. Humans confuse me, she said after a long pause. Ethan smiled faintly. That makes two of us. For the first time since arriving, Lyra relaxed fully against the chair beneath the thermal blanket. Not much, just enough for Ethan to notice. Sometimes healing did not look dramatic. Sometimes it looked like somebody finally believing they could close their eyes for a few hours without being abandoned. Morning cycle arrived slowly on Meridian Station. The artificial sunrise lamps embedded along the upper maintenance corridors flickered from dark blue into pale amber, while distant intercom systems announced docking schedules and freight departures across the station. Inside Unit C-19, Ethan sat at the folding table tightening bolts into a damaged service panel while stale coffee steamed beside his elbow. He had barely slept. Not because of Lyra. Because of the supervisor review waiting for him in less than an hour. The old heating vent rattled overhead with stubborn determination, somehow still alive despite every law of engineering. Lyra stood near the narrow ceiling vent watching the stars fade behind incoming cargo traffic. Fresh light reflected softly against her silver hair, while oversized freighters drifted past the station like floating mountains wrapped in engine glow. She looked healthier this morning. Still thin, still exhausted beneath the surface, but no longer fragile in the same way she had looked in the food court. Warmth had returned to her face. You should go to your review, she said quietly without turning around. Ethan tightened one last bolt before setting the screwdriver aside. Probably. And afterward, he shrugged. Depends how inspirational management feels today. Lyra lowered her eyes toward the crowded traffic lanes outside the vent window. You are joking again. It is either that or panic. A faint smile touched her face before fading. Silence settled between them while station machinery vibrated softly through the walls. Ethan finally stood and grabbed his worn maintenance jacket from the back of the chair. There is instant oatmeal in the cabinet if you get hungry. Lyra turned toward him immediately. Ethan. Something in her voice stopped him before he reached the door. He looked back. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she slowly reached into the inner pocket of her oversized coat and removed a small metallic object wrapped in faded cloth. Ethan frowned slightly as she unfolded the fabric. Resting inside was a narrow silver crest no larger than 2 fingers. Beautifully crafted. Ancient-looking. The symbol etched across its surface matched the hologram he had seen in the food court. House Vane. What is that? He asked quietly. Lyra stared at the crest in silence for a long moment before answering. The last official seal of my family. Ethan felt the room grow strangely still around them. You kept that hidden this whole time? It is worth enough to buy an entire docking sector. Her silver eyes lifted toward him slowly. Or enough to have me killed for carrying it. Ethan looked at the crest again. Suddenly, the oversized coat and hunger and exhaustion felt even more unreal beside the object resting in her hand. Royalty reduced to sleeping in a maintenance unit with borrowed blankets and instant noodles. Lyra, he said carefully. Who exactly are you? She took a slow breath before answering. My mother controlled the outer trade systems before the collapse. My father commanded border fleets. House Vane decided who received food shipments and medical access across nearly 40 colonies. Ethan remained quiet. When the routes began failing, she continued softly. My family protected our central worlds first. Her voice tightened slightly after that. Millions outside those systems were abandoned. The station noise beyond the walls suddenly felt very far away. Ethan looked at the silver crest in her trembling hand. And people blame your family for it. Lyra nodded. Once. They should. You were what? Ethan frowned. 16. Old enough to know it was wrong. The guilt in her voice sounded heavier than exhaustion now, like something carried for years without rest. I tried to speak against them, she whispered. Nobody listened. Ethan leaned quietly against the table while morning light from the vent reflected across the tiny room. So you ran. No, Lyra lowered her eyes again. I stayed until the colonies revolted. Until the riots began. until people starved outside our gates while we still held banquets inside. Her fingers tightened around the silver crest. Then I realized my family would rather protect power than people. Ethan watched her carefully. The shame in her expression looked genuine. Not political. Not rehearsed. Human. That is why I left. The room remained silent except for the distant hum of Meridian Station waking for another cycle. Finally, Ethan stepped closer and gently pushed the folded cloth back toward her hands. You should keep it, he said softly. Lyra blinked once. After everything I just told you? Ethan shrugged faintly. Seems to me you are carrying enough already. For the first time since he met her, Lyra looked at him without fear behind her eyes. Only disbelief. Like kindness still felt harder to understand than cruelty. The station alarms began exactly 12 minutes after Ethan left for his supervisor review. Deep metallic tones rolled through Meridian Station with enough force to vibrate the walls of Unit C-19, while emergency lights flashed across the maintenance corridors outside in sharp pulses of crimson and white. Lyra immediately stood from the chair, silver eyes narrowing toward the ceiling speakers. Docking priority alert. Unauthorized military vessels entering perimeter range. Repeat. Unauthorized military vessels entering perimeter range. Through the narrow vent window near the ceiling, the stars vanished behind shadows. Massive shadows. Lyra stepped closer slowly, her breath catching as dark silhouettes drifted across the observation lanes outside Meridian Station. Warships. Dozens of them. Sleek silver hulls wrapped in glowing blue engine light carrying the unmistakable crest of House Vane across their armored sides. Ethan returned less than 5 minutes later looking exhausted and irritated until he saw the emergency lights flooding the corridor outside his unit. Please tell me the station is not exploding, he muttered while entering the room. Then he followed Lyra's stare toward the vent window and froze completely. One enormous command vessel drifted directly outside the station now, larger than entire docking sectors, its polished silver hull reflecting Meridian's lights like liquid metal. Smaller escort ships surrounded it in silent formation. Well, Ethan said quietly after a long moment. That seems excessive. Lyra looked pale beneath the flashing emergency lights. They found me. The station intercom crackled alive again. Attention, all personnel. Docking Bay 3 has been sealed under external diplomatic authority. Ethan slowly looked toward her. Diplomatic authority? Lyra lowered her eyes briefly before answering. House Vane still controls 3 surviving core systems. Ethan leaned against the table and let out a tired breath through his nose. Of course they do. A loud knock suddenly echoed against the metal door of Unit C-19. Not aggressive. Formal. Precise. Ethan and Lyra exchanged one silent look before he crossed the room and opened the door halfway. 4 tall figures stood outside in silver ceremonial armor illuminated by the corridor's red emergency lights. Their pale blue skin matched Lyra's species exactly. Behind them stood an older alien woman wearing a long dark coat embroidered with silver thread and royal insignias. Her silver hair was pulled tightly behind her shoulders while exhaustion lined the sharp elegance of her face. The woman's eyes immediately found Lyra. Relief broke across her expression so suddenly it almost hurt to witness. Lady Lyra, she whispered softly. Lyra stood frozen near the vent window. Aunt Celine. Ethan stepped quietly aside while the armored escorts remained motionless in the corridor. Celine entered the small maintenance unit slowly, her gaze lingering briefly across the cramped room, the rattling heater, the chipped bowls still sitting near the kitchenette sink. We searched 12 systems for you, Celine said. The fleet thought you were dead. Lyra folded her arms tightly across herself beneath the oversized coat. Maybe part of me was. Silence settled heavily inside the tiny room. The older woman's eyes finally shifted toward Ethan, standing near the door. She studied the worn maintenance uniform, the grease stains on his sleeves, the exhausted circles beneath his eyes. You sheltered her, Celine said quietly. Ethan shrugged once. Mostly I gave her noodles. To his surprise, the older woman bowed her head slightly. Then House Vane owes you more than it can repay. Ethan glanced awkwardly toward Lyra. Yeah. I am not really comfortable with people talking like that. A faint smile touched Celine's face for the first time. You sound exactly like the reports described. Lyra looked confused. Reports? Celine turned toward her gently. The station cameras captured everything yesterday. Ethan blinked. Wait, there are reports about noodles now. About a human maintenance worker who shared his meal with a starving stranger while the rest of the station laughed. The older woman's voice softened. Do you know how rare that has become? Ethan looked away uncomfortably while the emergency lights continued pulsing across the walls around them. He had never considered any of it important. Just dinner. Just kindness. Just refusing to become one more person willing to look away. Lyra stepped closer to him slowly, silver eyes reflecting the red station lights and distant stars beyond the vent window. I can return with them now, she said softly. The fleet will rebuild my position inside House Vane. Ethan nodded once. Sounds important. It is. Her voice grew quieter after that. But before I met you, I believed kindness always came with conditions. Ethan looked at her for a long moment while the station hummed softly around them. Then he reached over to the folding table and picked up the old plastic cafeteria tray still sitting beside the empty noodle bowls. The same tray from the food court. The same cheap dinner that changed everything. He held it out toward her with a tired half-smile. Yes, Meridian Station finally served one decent meal. Lyra stared at the tray